Okay, so I hope everyone is doing okay. Um, so I'll continue talking about. We just unfortunately we only have 2 days for ethics. I could have talked more about it, but we will keep talking about ethics even when we move to talk about different cases of research in future classes. Um, this is part two. So as we started on Monday, we're going to start this lecture with another video. So sorry. Uh, Stop sharing by mistake. So we'll watch this video, and I'd like to hear reaction. By the way, if there's something wrong with the audio, let me know. Okay.
A decade earlier, psychologist Stanley Milgram had also looked at how we respond to authority. In order to understand how people were induced to obey unjust regimes and participate in atrocities such as the Holocaust, he set up an experiment. Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Where?
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud. Horse. Rock. House. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer. Horse.
Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
Refuse to go on. The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor, and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're going to get a shock. 180 volts.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Stand it. I'm not going to kill that man. Eh? I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next one. Slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that ball in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering with less voltage. Can't you check in to see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
Okay. So that was the Milgram's experiment. How many of you have heard of the Milgram experiment before? Could any one of you tell us what did you know about it before watching this video? What did you hear about the Milgram experiment? What do you remember about it? Yeah.
I learned about it in my sociology class,
Mhm.
and I knew that it was involving shocks and that it caused some emotional damage to people.
Okay, so shocks and emotional damage. Who else heard about the Milgram experiment?
I heard about it briefly in high school.
Okay. What do you remember from that thing in high school? What do you remember about? What was the thing that's stuck with you?
It was a long time ago, but what I remember, I didn't know it was, I forgot the name of it, but I remember like forcing people to like shock others and then having, like, I just remember we were talking about like ethics and then like how easy it is to like corrupt people into doing things against their conscience. That's about all I remember.
Okay. So I think Lily and Zoe, you both said that you heard about it. What do you remember about the Milgram experiment? What do you know about it?
Basically the same thing as here, except I'd never seen the video of it, so that was kind of cool. But yeah, just the fact that They had a person as an authority figure, and then just your average everyday person administering shocks more and more. But yeah, they kept doing it because the person in authority encouraged them to.
So were there actual shocks in the experiment? Yeah. So there were no actual electrical shocks. So what was the problem then?
Participants were being deceived because they thought the shocks were real.
Okay, participants were deceived. So the participant thought the shocks were real, but they were not. Again, what's wrong with that? Isn't that the point of the experiment? You wanted to see if. Well, by the way, what's the point of the experiment? So let me go take a step back. What was the objective of the experiment? It was mentioned in the video. What's the objective?
They presented it as being to test people's memory.
That was okay. That's good. So that was the pretense. That was what people were told. But from the video, like, what did the researcher want to know? What they want to gauge from that experiment?
Like how far people will go under the under the influence of an authority figure.
Yes, yes. So Milgram basically, either his family survived. Yeah, so he's Jewish from the Bronx, and I think his family, or not all of his family, some of his family survived the Holocaust, some did not. Um, and so his point was like, how come many people participate in that, like the Nazi guards, people who were in those camps, and they just follow orders. And probably before that, they were just decent German citizens. So how could that happen? That was his point. And he was saying then the objective of this experiment is to see how far, as Josephine was saying, how far would people go like when it comes to obeying an authority figure. Who was the authority figure in this experiment?
He said a man in a white coat.
Yeah, a man in a white coat. So you go into like a lab, there's a man in a white coat, you would think he's like some sort of a researcher, a doctor, working with a prestigious institution or like a government or a university. And so he was telling people to induce electrical shocks, want an actor to pretend, to see if people respond. So, I'll go back to my question. Then, where is the harm? What was if the point is to see if people would obey immoral orders, then what's wrong with this study? Let me ask it another way. Was there any harm being carried out? Yes. So who was harmed in this study?
The participants thought that they were doing something that went against their conscience.
Yes. So they were put under like an immense psychological harm. So the people who were taking the role of the teacher were actually the people being harmed, not these students. The students were actually into the joke. They were part of the research team. But we're talking about the harm done to the participants, people who thought they are taking part in a legitimate research, and they were asked to do things against their conscience. All right, sir. So, if you remember the ethical principles we mentioned on Monday, if you watched Monday's lecture, what ethical principles did this experiment violate? What principles did this experiment violate? Remember there were 3 principles. Can you remember one of them?
This one violates right to honesty.
Right. So, so that deception. But what if deception was part of the core of the study? So you were deceived, but then you were told later, by the way, no one was shocked. So you had that one. What else? So we said honesty. What else? It was related to honesty. What is the first principle? First principle.
Autonomy of individuals.
Yes, autonomy. Okay. So how did this study violate the principle of autonomy?
It didn't allow the participants to exercise their own free will, I guess, in the sense. It deceived them into thinking that they didn't have a choice.
Right. So you remember when this gentleman was saying, I want to stop. What did the man in the white coat told him?
That he can't stop and he has to continue in the experiment.
Yes, yes. So remember I mentioned like the right to consent also include the right to withdraw. Okay, so even if someone consented to take part, and for any reason they want to withdraw, they should have the full right to do so. Were they put under pressure not to withdraw? Okay, so that violates the right to for consent. So even if an intention, and by the way, that's a good occasion to mention, this applies to personal relationships as well, right? We're talking about like a romantic relationship. Pressure of preventing someone doesn't have to be explicit. So technically, the person say, "Please continue." So I did not force him, but it's just the whole situation. Like it felt like I don't have the choice. So similar, like someone someone in a higher rank, like invite you to their office, and they hinted that you cannot leave. Hey, by the way, you could leave if you want, but this is important. I mean, yeah, there is what we call like the power dimension, right? You're taking, but keep in mind this is in the 50s, so you walk into a building, there's a man in a white coat, and they're electrifying people. So you could think like what's happening in people's mind, like this could be someone with like the CIA or some shit. So I should not mess with these people. So actually, some interviews with participants say that like they actually thought, you know what, these people could get me in trouble if I refuse. Okay, so that was one. So that's the consent was not really a full consent. What else? So that's one principle that violated. What other principle that's been violated? Starts with a B.
Would it be beneficence because the like perceived risk of what they were doing would like not outweigh the benefits of the research?
You mean the benefits did not outweigh the risk? The risk did outweigh the benefits, right? So yeah, they were put under like an immense state of like immense pressure, like they were put under like psychological harm with minimal benefits to the participants. So what did the participants get out of this? Right? They got $4, right? They were more significant in 1950s, but yeah, like the psychological effects, like could someone that could haunt them for days, even if they would know later. It was not like a decent experiment to do. Okay, and so that's about the amalgam experiment. So this leads us also to talk about like a third or a fourth principle, depending on how you want to count them, which is the principle of non-malfeasance. So you know, malfeasance is like evil, like doing harm. So non-malfeasance is the principle not only to do no harm, but stop harm. And so the idea is, if you are a researcher, so we know the Milgram experiments don't put people under pressure. But supposedly, if you as a researcher see people under pain, great deal of pain, you have the responsibility to intervene, even if it stops you from conducting the research. In other words, even if it's beneficial for you as a researcher for that thing to continue, would you let it slide, or like would you intervene to help? That's the issue of the non-malfeasance. Have you heard? Have you heard about the bystander effect? So there was a case it's a very famous case in New York City in the 50s, and it was like a woman, like someone broke into her apartment, and she was yelling for help. She was assaulted, yelling for help for like 30 minutes. The assailant actually left the apartment, came back, and killed her. Many people saw it or heard it, but no one called the police. Have you heard that story before? Right. What do you remember about it? What's the issue with that story? What did it show us about humans, or like human beings?
People thought that because everybody, like, they were hearing the screaming, they kind of assumed that other people were calling the police already. So they thought, like, oh, I don't need to call the police because it's already been reported.
Right. Yeah. So that's called the bystander effect. So you're walking, you see someone getting mugged or like kicked or shot. You think, there's a lot of people here, so I'm assuming someone did call the police, or someone would call the police. So you just keep walking, right? But then if everybody does that, then yeah, it's a problem. By the way, just to let you know, that story, someone was saying actually, some people did call the police. There was something wrong, like the police didn't come, but the majority did not. So it's the major principle holds. So the idea is, you as a researcher have a responsibility, actually, more than anyone else, to report. Okay? And let me give you an example of how this could happen in research. So imagine you're interested in understanding gangs, criminal gangs. And that's something people do, by the way. There's like tons of books on gangs. If you take sociology classes, they like to do gang stuff. And so you're interviewing gang members, they're in prison or like outside. You got the permission. You have an agreement of confidentiality with them, okay? And I assume you remember what confidentiality is. And all of a sudden, you hear like they revealed a plot to you. They were going to rob a bank, or like to kill a person, someone from a rival gang or something, okay? Then you have an obligation to tell the authorities if you hear that. Would you tell the authorities if you hear about the gangster plot to kill someone? Even if you have a confidentiality agreement. Zoe, what's your rationale? Why would you tell the police?
Because it causes harm to someone else or themselves. I feel like there's a understanding that if someone tells you something that's going to harm themselves or someone else, you need to help someone else.
Yeah. So this is an exception to the confidentiality agreement. So even in like therapy or like doctor-patient confidentiality, if the patient reveals something that they're going to do in the future, then you have the obligation to report it. And the trick is, however, you don't have to report things that happened in the past. That's a tricky one. So in therapy, so you interview a gangster in a prison and they confess to a crime they've done in the past. You have no way of stopping that, right? It already happened. Regardless of what the legal system, what the ruling of the courts was, either way, it doesn't change. Once you have a ruling and they confess later, it won't change anything. So yeah, actually, you don't have an obligation to report that. But the issue is because you could have the opportunity to stop it, then you have the obligation to stop it. If you can't stop it, you must stop it. That's the rule. Okay, so that's when you're interviewing some of the perpetrators. What about you're interviewing like victims of like, assuming you're interviewing a survivor victim of like domestic abuse, and you want to understand like the psychology, the trauma that domestic abuse victims experience, and then they tell you that the violence is continuing. Like the person is still being hit, like kept out of her house, and being abused, and she's telling you that under the impression that you won't tell anyone, right? Maybe she begged you, don't tell anyone. It would ruin my relationship. Then do you have an obligation to report or not?
I think yes, but I think that's a situation where you'd have to be like really careful because there's a chance that intervening could like result in worse harm. So you'd have to like be careful in that situation, I think.
Could you elaborate on that? So what do you mean by careful?
Yeah, because a lot of domestic abuse victims, like the reason why they keep it a secret is because they're afraid of retaliation. And that's something that does happen a lot. Like if it's not gone about the right way, like they can even like be killed by their abusers. So it would be important to be sensitive if you were going to intervene.
So how should you intervene? Who should intervene actually?
I feel like domestic abuse victims are also more complicated because oftentimes there's an intimate relationship. So there could also be different family dynamics, children involved. And so that requires like just getting professionals into the situation. So if you are not of authority to handle that, you should pass on that responsibility.
So that's a great answer, Gianna. And so if you ever do, or anyone is doing this type of research, you actually have to be backed up with the resources of people who could help. So if like it's about domestic abuse, you have to tell if you discover something like either we're talking about therapists, like people who could take care of that victim, either like in terms of like a shelter or like something to like support the children or like legal aid, any sort of that. Like you have to prepare the resources. And so when you intervene, you don't intervene yourself. You actually work with these type of authorities, whether like it's law enforcement, legal aid, therapy, public health, etc., and like social workers, and those would handle the situation. And so that's right. Like you don't make a stupid intervention, and so that's the key. That's the key. You hand it over. So if you would file, for example, an RB request to conduct this type of research, they will ask you like what type of aid resources you would provide for the victims. Like if something happened, assuming that assailant or perpetrator shows up at your door, like they heard you're doing some reviewing at University of San Diego, and that person showed up, what legal or security measures have you put that won't put that person in harm if it's ever going to be revealed? And so, yeah, so this goes beyond the idea of do no harm to the insanely like stop harm as much as you can, right? And so it's sort of like we add another one. So we talking about autonomy, so that's like having informed consent. Remember, it's informed and free to get in and free to opt out. That's the key. Beneficence is basically the do no harm and you minimize harm as much as you can. Non-malfeasance, which is part of beneficence, you can argue, but it goes beyond that to stopping harm as well. And justice is what we mentioned about the issue of like non-discrimination. So if you remember the Tuskegee study, so no discrimination on basis of like race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, faith, or whatnot. And so when you are conducting an experiment or like a study, you should think of these three questions. Like this would be the moral or ethical cost-benefit analysis. That is to say, is the project worth pursuing? Like, do you have a legitimate research question that would be beneficial to society if we discover the question? So going back to the Milgram experiment, do you think the idea behind the experiment was legitimate? Do you think this type of research was legitimate? Why do you think that, Josephine? You were nodding.
I think it's a genuine kind of like sociological question and psychological question, because I think could be the case for a lot of things that happen. I mean, like it also kind of reminds me of the Stanford experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I think the experiments definitely could have been done better, but I think it's a valid question to be asked.
Okay, so yeah, it could be that the question, like how far people, like we want to know, like understand like the authoritarian impulses or like submission to authority, how submission to authority works. This would have psychological and sociological benefits. So if that's the case, what the harm necessary in that experiment, in the Milgram experiment, what is the harm necessary to achieve the outcomes we want? What that level of harm necessary to answer our research question, or Milgram's research question? Put another way, could you think of a different study that could have achieved the same outcomes? Like, yeah, we could study how would people react to authority commands without telling them to shock people. Could have we done that instead? Can you think of any example? So now you're the person in a coat. What would you tell people to do? You want to see how far they would go. So aside, like, it doesn't involve shocking people. What would you tell them to do just to test if they would obey you or not? Can you think of any examples?
I think I remember hearing about a study that may not have been exactly testing like authority, but where basically you just put a bunch of people in a room and you're like, okay, the study's going to start soon. And then you just keep saying the study's going to start soon, it's delayed. And then you just see like who stays the longest and like when people leave, etc. So that could be a way if you like had an authority figure in the room that was like, we really need you here, like, you know, it's gonna start soon.
Yeah, Yeah, so that's exactly. So that's still. So by the way, we said so that's still somewhat harmful. You're wasting people's time, but it's part of the same. Like it was no under like it was not like an intense psychological pressure. It was like okay, we're just wasting people's time. Like, that's about it. And no one has like the perception of harm or like psychological harm. So that's one example. Um, there was another study that is related, also done conducted during the 50s. It's called the Usher study, and so they would draw like two lines on like on like a blackboard, and then they will they would ask the participants which one is longer than the other. Okay. Then there would be a line that is longer. So let's say it's line A. It's longer than line B. So people would say line A. And then you'll bring in some like experts, and they will say, actually, no, line B is longer than line A. And then you'll ask the participants again, which one do you think is longer? And the point is, if you're following, you have a herd mentality. Would you follow what the experts are saying, even though your eyes are telling you otherwise? Or you would, yeah, you will just stick to your gun and say, no, actually, I refuse to believe you. This is what, this is the true, what the true geometry is showing. Right? So there are multiple ways, right? Like you could think, you can bring people into a lab, wear a white coat, and ask them to do ridiculous things, like stand on 1 feet, or like do something stupid with your face, or like draw something like on the wall, like some stupid things. And this has been conducted before, by the way. There's some fun experiments that have been conducted, but it's gauged like the same thing, you know, like how far would people go, and it doesn't involve harming anyone. And then a question: would the participants end up with net positive outcomes? So think about like the Milgram experiments. Did they end up with more benefits than harm, or more harm than benefits? Yeah, so that's the key. It was more harm than benefits. They got $4, but other than that, they were left with a traumatizing experiment that might have lasted for the entire life. Here's another one. This is a little bit disturbing, by the way, so please bear with me. And this is very old, by the way.
In the early part of the 20th century, psychologists John Watson and Rosalie Rayner set out to teach a baby boy called Little Albert to fear white rats using the principle of classical conditioning. This is a film of their work. The film shows several phases of their study. First, as you see here, the investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, Little Albert had no fears of any animals, including, of course, white rats. Watson and Rayner then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through classical conditioning. In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat, making a very loud noise that greatly upset and frightened Albert. After 6 such pairings of the loud noise and the rat, it was believed that the boy had been conditioned to fear white rats. That is, Albert was now expected to react fearfully to white rats, whether the rats were paired with loud noises or not. In this next film sequence, we see Albert interacting with a white rat after the conditioning process. The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rats. Finally, the investigators expected that little Albert's conditioned fear of white rats would generalize to stimuli that were similar in key ways to a white rat. In this film segment, they were trying to demonstrate that the child now also reacted fearfully to similar objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a furry object, and a white mask worn by Watson himself.
Okay, that was a little disturbing. So what was wrong with this study? Anyone tell me one thing that was wrong with this study?
I mean, they were experimenting on a baby who can't consent to being a part of the study because it's a baby.
Yeah, to start, right. So they were experimenting with a baby. Although those parents gave permission, so the legal guardians, or like the parents, gave permission. So yeah, so there's that. What else? So aside from that issue, well, so yeah, no consent. What else? What happened to the baby?
I think not even like ethically speaking, it's just not a good study, because once you upset a baby with loud noises, it's probably gonna be upset. Like, just in general, like that baby is probably just not gonna be a happy baby for a while. So I think, like, obviously upsetting the baby in the first place is problematic ethically, but I don't even think it's a good study, because that's not how babies work.
Yeah. Let's go back to this question. So, if the project was pursuing, so what was the point of the study? Remember, what did they say?
It was like to condition him to fear white rats.
So the point of the study is like if people could be conditioned to fear things, right? Was that like the general objective of the study? Like, could people be conditioned to fear white rats or any other things? Don't we know that already? Like, we're all humans, I guess. We fear things, right? Like, there are things that we learn to fear. By the way, just a quick question. How many of you are afraid of rats in general?
It depends if the rat is like free inside of my home or like a pet.
Oh, okay. No, I'm talking about like street rats, like those big ones that could break into your apartment.
So I live in Hawaii and there's no rabies here, so I don't think I have a reasonable fear, but like
Oh,
I grew up in California and like have been to other countries and stuff like that, so I do have this like little fear, but I try not to let it take control.
anyone here from East Coast, East Coast City, like New York, Boston? Josephine, where are you from?
I'm from Connecticut, but I'm like 30 minutes away from New York City.
So you're familiar with New York City rats?
Yeah, they don't scare me. They just do their own thing.
Yeah, right. Well, they don't scare you in the subway, right? But if you ever lived in a Manhattan apartment, and yeah, you see those big rats coming, just looking. Yes, they're pretty disturbing. Like, and I'm talking like huge rats. I'm talking like cat-sized rats. And for me, even like the small ones, so they can get into your food. It's really a frightening experience. They're not and they're not healthy. Like it's a major cause of disease. New York City has like some weird diseases, like only common in like sort of like developing countries and stuff, because those rats are everywhere and they live in the sewer system. So my point is, this is a long way to say, yeah, people could be conditioned to fear rats. Like we fear a lot of things, like darkness, clowns. Some people fear clowns. I don't know why, but some people do. Emily, do you fear clowns? I never understood that. Like, why?
I don't know if it's like because of like the movie It or just like I don't know. There's just something about the way they dress and the makeup they wear and the fact that like initially they would like do like children's birthday parties. I just find it so deeply disturbing.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, like some kids fear clowns. My one of my sisters, like up until she became like she grew up like in high school or something. She had been afraid of like dolls because you know that movie Chucky, remember? Yeah, like she watched it like without the supervision of the parents, and she just developed that fear like she won't have dolls. Like she threw out all of her dolls. It was stupid. I watched Chucky as a kid and I thought it was comedic. I actually laughed a lot. I enjoyed it, and so something probably wrong with me. But the point is, this type of experiment had no point. Like, what something, could you tell us something new that we would learn from this experiment, right? Like, you're traumatizing a baby, probably for the rest of his life, and for no benefits whatsoever. Like, there are multiple ways to study conditioning, and this adds no value whatsoever. So, yeah, like, Lily was right. It was not even a good study to begin with. Like the Milgram experiment, you could argue it's actually a pretty good study, but like there were some ethical issues. But this was not even a good study. So that's the thing. Like if the harm doesn't outweigh the good, then there's no point in doing it. Can you think before I move on? Can you think of an example where the harm outweighed the good? Like you would inflict harm, but it's necessary. Can you think, for example, like an easy one in the medical field? Can you do harm to produce more good?
Like if you have to remove a limb to save a life or something?
Yeah, yeah. Or in the medical field, for example, think about like curing cancer or like cancer treatment. How do they treat cancer? Like in most cases,
Radiation.
radiation and chemotherapy. And chemotherapy is really painful. And you could think like, yeah, the early experiments, my God, like those people went through hell. But the point was, this is necessary because whatever pain they were going through, with full consent and like compensation and all of that. But the ending results, like we discovered something that cured cancer, and it saved then tons of lives, right? We in communication, don't think we ever get into that extreme level, but just in general, like sometimes yeah, harm is necessary, but like you have to show that this harm is necessary for the purpose of the study, and then the benefits we're getting from this study is going to be great for society at large. Speaking of which, so supposedly, let's give an example from our field. So supposedly you want to study the impact of hate speech on targeted group, in which you want to test if exposure to hateful messages affects the well-being of participants. So let's say, for example, I want to study the psychological effects of watching white supremacist videos. Right? So I'm conducting an experiment, and I'm exposing people to white supremacist rhetoric. Like, and it's with full consent. I explain, like, you're going to watch white supremacist videos. It could be disturbing, whatever, and then people are going to watch it, and then I would see their psychological reaction. Should such a study be allowed or not?
are these videos like historical, or I guess like things that have already happened naturally without it being staged?
Yeah, so it happened. So let's say we go to the KKK website and we get like a speech by like one of their leaders, whatever. We take some clips and we show it to people.
I think this is interesting because, okay, I'm an ethnic studies major, so you know we do critically analyze videos sometimes, but there's always like a predisposed message like, hey, this could be a trigger warning, like this is what we're going to be doing. So I feel like that is giving us consent to participate through this educational experience. And if it is triggering, it's like you're welcome to leave. Like you're not being held against your own will to watch these videos. Like if this is too much, you can step out of class or you can log off, I guess, and take care of yourself. So I think it is allowed. And like, I guess for the second question, like to ensure the well-being, it's like making sure that everyone is aware of what's going to be talked about, what might happen, and then therefore you can move forward with like self-care.
How would you make those things clear then in the consent form? What would you put in the consent form?
I think before playing any videos, like sharing all topics that will be discussed, and then also knowing that the door is open to leave.
Okay. Then my follow-up question would be, and this is for everybody, as we can jump in. How far would you go with the content? So, like, it range from someone saying, "Hey, like white people," and they would use the phrase "colored," I would believe, or something else, should be separated, or like we should kick foreigners. So let's say this is like level 1 versus like extreme stuff. Like we should kill all those, like, and then calling names, those rats. We should smash them, and then some N words there, some anti-Semitic stuff, some like really hateful stuff. I'm not talking about like I'm not talking about trolling level or like I'm talking about like serious white supremacist stuff. How far would you go?
I think, well, this is interesting too because I'm only thinking from my own personal experience as being like a student and like going through like lower division to upper division level classes about this like critical race theory. Whereas if this were to just be an open study for anyone, I don't think it's appropriate. I'm like, no, like this requires like an understanding of certain backgrounds and then like given a tool set to think critically. Whereas like if you were just to throw people into a room and be like, we're gonna watch this video, like blah blah blah, like I don't think that's appropriate at all.
I think, yeah. Any other thoughts? And you don't really have to have like, even if you have a conflicting opinions about this, is fine. What do you like? What things like you fear about this type of studies, and what things make you think they should be allowed? It should be allowed.
I think it's difficult to measure the psychological well-being of somebody, like quantitatively specifically. So I think people can get pushed past their limits without really like meaning to. So I think it's hard to find. I don't know. It's muddy waters, kind of. I think it's hard to find like a limit or to measure where to stop, sort of.
Yeah, it's exactly right. Who should then be asked to see how far should we go? Who would be capable of assessing that?
Like a psychologist, probably.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So before doing this, so imagine if I asked you, and Gianna was sort of hinting to that. Imagine I get some freshmen or like first year students, and yeah, in the room, and hey, we're going to watch KKK videos. Let me know what you think. I'm assuming most of you would tell me this is inappropriate because what Gianna was saying, like there's a background. So yeah, if you ask psychologists, like there are people who work with this stuff, like what issues like can we share? Like we could start from like just trolling on YouTube, on YouTube comment section, like to see how would people react, uh, and then see how it goes. Like it could be linked to the age and background of the participants. And we can ask people like Gianna, or like people in ethnic studies, like, do you have a taxonomy of like the type of hate? So there are people who specialize in hate speech, as a matter of fact. So could we work with those, and then we go into like before producing it to the general public? And so the principles that apply in here are the same that we said earlier. So are people really getting informed constantly? And please put like 100 line under informed. So like you have a clear language, and so like you really understand what you're going into. Are you having clear language, and the people at such a level to understand what to expect? And also, does the harm, or sorry, do the benefits outweigh the harm? So could you gauge the same benefits, that is to say, how would people react to hate speech without going to the maximal level of triggering or like infuriating people? All right. So again, in practice, there is, as Josephina said, like muddy water or gray area, but at least this is what you should try to do before being involved in such studies. We're about to run out of time, so I don't. I only have a few slides. It's to go quick. So then there are ethical issues after you conduct the research, and they have to do with like being truthful and not making up stuff. And so that means you don't fabricate your results, you don't make up numbers, you don't juke the stats, as they say. And so in analyzing, you become truthful of what your hypothesis was, and if the results confirm or disconfirm your hypothesis. And if they disconfirm some of your hypotheses, you should say that without manipulating the numbers. There's something called the open data movement, in which now scholars would put their hypotheses or like their research procedures up there on the web even before they collect the data. And once they collect the data, then they'll post the results. So they will hold themselves accountable. So this is a growing movement, and because in academia, we have many cases in which this fabrication. There's actually a very famous one. This was like a few years ago, a famous food researcher at Cornell, and he was super famous. Like he had his own products. He specialized like in dieting and diet programs, and he would sell different packages. And one day, one of his PhD students started to review the lab reports, the actual numbers, and find that they disconfirm whatever this person was pretending for the last 15 years. And so this was he mentioned many studies. Some of them were featured on like morning shows and newspapers, and maybe you've heard of them. So one study, he claimed people who grocery shop hungry or while hungry buy more calories. How many of you heard this thing before? Like if you go to the supermarket while you're hungry, you buy more things. Yeah. So this was totally fake. It could be true though, that the hypothesis could still be true, but the study that this person conducted was basically fake. He just made it up. Pre-ordering lunch can help you choose healthier food. Also not confirmed. Serving people out of large bowls encourage them to serve themselves larger portions. Not confirmed. So you could do tremendous amount of harm. Like you could change policy. Like imagine like school programs for like meals. A lot of consequences weren't for like because of these experiments or studies, and they were all fake. They're just made up. So that's like the harm of fabrication. And finally, there's the principle of non-discrimination, that whenever you present your results or frame your research, it should never be framed as such to discriminate against any group or to support marginalization or oppression. So we've seen a lot of cases of like scientific justification of racist programs or policies. This was a paper published in not the 1950s or 1960s. There was a paper published in 2012, and it argued, so the question was, do pigmentation and melanocortin system modulate aggression and sexuality in humans as they do in other animals? So the paper argued that melanin levels in humans is a predictor of aggressive behavior. Who does that refer to? People with high melanin levels?
This targets people of color.
Yeah, yeah. So it's basically he's basically saying people with darker skins are more aggressive, and it was based on either past studies. So this paper did not collect original data at all. So no experiment was conducted whatsoever. It relied on past refuted past studies. So all of the things that it cited were refuted to support its argument. And it took like pigmentation levels in animals to apply it to humans. So they were like one type of fish. Well, like he talked about crows, and they were like some crows with like darker feathers were more aggressive than other crows. Therefore, people with darker skins would be more aggressive than other people with skins. So this is the problem of generalization that's not applicable at all, but it's something that's out there. And to remind you, yeah, this was published in 2012, and it was only retracted in 2020, basically after the Floyd incident. So those things happen, and we should be aware of them. So that's it for today. Do you have any questions? Okay, so to remind you, we have an exam on Friday. So you don't have to, there's no class. The exam is going to be multiple choice and true or false. You're going to have full 50 minutes to finish it. The time window though would extend for like 4 hours, so you could take it at like 9, 9:30, 10, or even earlier. And it would be straightforward. There are no trick questions. If you study the concepts from the study guide and go back to the textbook and the lectures to find like the definitions and examples. No trick questions again. I won't get something from like the footnote in page 55. Like I'll cover the topics that we talked extensively about during the lecture. So yeah, and it should be easy, and I hope you do well. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor, I have a question.
Yeah.
What time will the exam be available starting tomorrow? Or sorry, on Friday?